So since we're going to be going back over the few bits of information from Tuesday, that'll be recorded on the next session. But thank you so much. So we'll focus on France and England in the conflict that they had, and then leading to the chain of events for the Revolutionary War. I apologize for trying to find the video that I wanted. Go ahead.
Treasure Beans.
Yeah.
I just got to class. They said you counted me absent. I was talking to my counselor.
Okay, who's this?
Onager. McBroom.
Okay. Okay. So the population of about 2 million, and 1.4 million would have been British, and actually, I'm sorry, more than that would have been British, probably 1.9 million, as opposed to around 100,000 for the French. So a big difference, disparity between the French and English population. Okay, so I've got my video ready. Good deal. Get back to where I can see you. The colonists enjoyed something that their fellow let me back up 1 second. That 2 million was the British colonies. I apologize. And there was less than 100,000 French. So that's key as we lead up to that war. The colonists in the 13 colonies enjoyed something far, I say enjoyed, they were privileged to have something that those in England did not have. England being an island, and so the borders, being basically enclosed by the waters around them. And so wherever you lived in England, that's pretty much the area where you stayed. In the colonies, they enjoyed much more social mobility. They were able to move to different places much more readily than those in England. So social mobility, which, back then was a pretty big deal. Today we go all over the place with relative ease and don't think about it, but in the mid 1700s, you pretty much were born, lived, and died probably within the same 10, 20 square mile radius your whole life. So this social mobility in the new colonies was a very nice privilege that the colonists enjoyed. Most of the colonists lived in small towns or villages and farmed their lands. The bigger cities that we talked about, like Philadelphia and New York City, really had issues with a lot of diseases. And but even having said that, being disease-ridden, people coming over from Europe had an offer of better opportunity, even in these big cities. I think we mentioned that the southern colonies had a much higher slave population. New England and the middle colonies were vastly lower in numbers of slaves. That is a key factor leading up to the Civil War in the 1860s. And then for a few minutes, I want to talk about the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was a very broad, sweeping religious revival, not only in the colonies, but also in England and other parts of Europe. You'll remember that the Puritans came and they wanted to basically found a perfect colony where church and state were not separated, and they could set up a utopia, a kingdom of heaven on earth, wherein everyone was part of the church. Ideally, everyone could claim to be a Christian according to the Puritan definition. And they would then shine brightly. Remember that? City on a hill, shining brightly back to England as an example of how this Christianity religion is to be set up. Early on, everybody had to go to church, even if one had not made what they would call a profession of faith. Many evangelical churches still seek for people to have a profession of faith, but the Puritans were much more I don't want to use the word strict, but they were much more deliberate and careful about if someone claimed to have made a profession of faith, they would come under, or the Puritans would examine them very closely, question them, question their experience to see if their profession was genuine. And then, of course, you would be baptized, become a member of that church. And so while everybody went to church and that was a law and everybody had to pay the church tithes so to support the minister, not everybody had yet become a church member. But their goal was that by requiring people to go to church and hear preaching and be with Christians, they would also be saved or make a profession of faith. And so in the running of the towns, only church members, and of course this is just the white males, only church members could serve as the select men. That was a term used in New England for the political leaders of the towns, select men. They had to be church members. And so this was how these communities started out. And the Puritans also believed in infant baptism. Not only were people baptized who were adults who had made a profession of faith, but they also believed in infant baptism, which they believed placed all infants under the covenant of grace. And then as they grew into adulthood, their hopes would be that they would make a personal profession. So this is something that many Protestants reject today, infant baptism. But the Puritans embraced it, not as an act of saving the infant, but putting them in the covenant community. And so by doing that, the hopes would be that they would be raised in the church. Eventually, they would become church members who had a profession of faith and become outstanding citizens too. Well, as life in New England progressed through the 17th century into the 18th century, more and more of those baptized infants, as they grew into adults, were not experiencing professions of faith. And so this became a concern for the Puritan leaders. And so they came up with what was known as the Halfway Covenant. And what this did was this allowed for people who were in the church, maybe they had been baptized as infants, but they had not yet made a profession of faith. But it allowed for their children to be baptized as well. Because when they first started, only people who were members of the church, only their children would be baptized. And so as more of those children grew into adults and never made a profession of faith, because not all people were baptized as infants. And if that's confusing, please let me know. I'm trying to get this straight. Everybody who came over as an adult had to go to the church, but they might not have been baptized as an infant. But those that were church members, their infants would be baptized. So if there's any confusion there, let me know. I'll try to clarify that. So they came up with a halfway covenant. People who had been baptized as infants but had not made a profession of faith, they would allow their children to also be baptized in hopes that they would eventually, by being exposed to the church, exposed to preaching, would be saved or make a profession of faith eventually. So when we get to the 1720s, many ministers in New England and even into Pennsylvania, where many Presbyterians had settled, many Presbyterians from Ireland and Scotland had come over. But the Presbyterians and the Puritans had a very similar view of salvation and church life. So in the 1720s, many of these ministers were very concerned about the spiritual condition of the colonies, especially in New England. And the church life had become very formal. For example, most ministers read their sermons. They had written them out word for word as a manuscript. They would read them. They would try not to show any emotion because they didn't want to influence people with emotion. They wanted only the preaching of the word to touch somebody's heart. Ministers were kind of like upper class, and church members were not lower class, but more of a maybe a middle to lower class. So ministers were highly respected. They were seen as authorities. You did not question them. And the ministers became, some of the ministers in the 1720s started to become very concerned. They also felt like many of the churches and ministers were cold as ice. There wasn't real spiritual vitality in life. And so they started to pray for revival. Some of them started to preach more fiery sermons, show more emotion. And this also began to happen. It also started to happen in Great Britain as well, in Europe. The Great Awakening was happening across the Atlantic Ocean in both places. You had in Pennsylvania you had a Dutch Reformed preacher named Theodore Frelinghuysen, who was very fiery. He influenced a Presbyterian from Pennsylvania named Gilbert Tennant, who led a group of Presbyterians called the New Lights. The New Lights believed in a very vital, personal, heartfelt religion. The Old Lights were the older ministers who believed in a very formal, more of an intellectual faith. And so you had this split in the Presbyterian church. You had it in the congregational churches of Massachusetts and Connecticut. They were called New Sides and Old Sides. And you had this young preacher in Massachusetts named Jonathan Edwards, who was the most influential preacher in the Great Awakening in America, from America. Jonathan Edwards was really a unique mixture of both the old and the new. He continued to preach by reading his sermons word for word, not showing much emotion, but the content of his sermons really were challenging to the people, to challenge them to have great affections for God, not just to have a intellectual knowledge of Bible doctrine and Christian truth, but to have a deep, heartfelt experience. I don't know, is his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, is it still included in high school literature textbooks? Has anybody read that sermon in a class? I remember it was in my English literature class in high school. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He preached this sermon in the 1720s, and a great revival broke out in Northampton, Massachusetts. Okay, thank you, Summer. And so this spread in the New England colonies and in Pennsylvania. Then you had a very fiery, dramatic preacher come from England named George Whitefield in the 1730s. And the Great Awakening just caught on like fire and spread across the New England colonies and revived the churches. And all of this is said to say this. I guess it's the preacher and me becoming long-winded. Sorry about that. But the Great Awakening led to a greater, with more emphasis on a heartfelt religion, personal experience. And many of these Great Awakening preachers questioned the spiritual condition of the older ministers who did not believe in emotion. Some of these new preachers of the Great Awakening even questioned the salvation of many of the old light and old side preachers. George Whitefield would preach out in fields, and he would invite the townspeople to come, and the church members would come and the townspeople would come, and he would have huge crowds while the churches on their Sunday gatherings would be very, very slim. And so what this did, what this introduced, and this will have a great effect in the revolution, is that the lay people in the churches started to question the authority of the ministers. And so hopefully you can see that the common people questioning the authorities, that is a very important seed that is planted in American society leading up to the revolution. Colonists will start to question the authority of their British leaders. Colonists start to question the authority of Britain thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean, taxing them and telling them what they can and cannot do. So that's why the Great Awakening is so important. This sort of leveling among church members and lay people having less or giving less authority or questioning the authority of their preachers and ministers is an important aspect of the American Revolution. All right, let's take a few minutes to watch this video on the Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials happened in 1691-92 in Salem, Massachusetts. I'm assuming everybody has heard of them. How many of you are not familiar with the details of this? You're not familiar with the details. So everybody is familiar with the details of the Salem witch trials? You guys are not in Smithville? Okay. So by the end of it, 19 people had been hanged as witches, and hundreds of others had been greatly affected or imprisoned by it. And it really was the result of some teenage girls and their started out kind of as a prank. And so let's watch.
In the late 1600s, a series of accusations resulted in nearly 24 people in New England being put to death. In the late 1600s, a series of accusations resulted in nearly 24 people in New England being put to death for supposedly practicing witchcraft. This incident has become known as the Salem witch trials. Who were the accused witches? What caused this event to occur? In 1600s colonial America, belief in the supernatural was very common. Many people attributed failing crops, family illnesses, or death to witchcraft. For example, if the family's livestock had unexpectedly died, this might have been a sign that a witch had cursed their family. It was these beliefs that helped fuel the hysteria in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. In late January and early February of 1692, two girls living in Salem Village, Betty Paris, age 9, and Abigail Williams, age 11, began exhibiting very unusual behavior. The girls threw things, screamed, wedged themselves underneath furniture, made bizarre sounds, and twisted themselves into odd positions. They also complained of unusual sensations, such as feeling that they were being pricked with pins. Other girls within the village also began displaying similar symptoms. Yet, the doctors who examined each of them could find no known physical ailment afflicting them. Certain individuals within the community became convinced that the girls had been cursed by witchcraft. Various efforts were made to identify who the witch might be. For example, a touch test was used. While one of the victims was having a fit, a group of accused women were asked to lay their hands on the girl one at a time. If the fit subsided, whoever was touching her at that moment was accused of being the witch who had cursed her. Another method used to identify the witch was known as a witch cake. This was a cake made using rye meal and urine from the afflicted girl. The cake was then fed to a dog. The belief was that the witch would experience intense physical pain when the cake was eaten, and this would identify her as a witch. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and a slave woman named Tituba were the first three to be arrested. Sarah Good was a homeless woman who had probably been accused simply because of her reputation in the community. Sarah Osborne rarely attended church, and the townspeople believed she only had her own self-interest in mind. It has been long believed that Tituba had entertained the local girls with stories about witches and fortune-telling. The citizens of Salem Village and nearby Salem Town began seeing witchcraft everywhere. In March of 1692, 4 more women were arrested. One was arrested simply because she dared to question whether the girl's symptoms were real or if they were just pretending. Another was accused because she wore black clothing and other outfits which the villagers deemed odd. As 1692 continued, more accusations were made and more individuals were arrested. The homes of the accused women were searched and any evidence was seized upon as witchcraft. If ointments or healing herbs were found, this was sure evidence that they might be a witch. Of course, many of these women did have such items because they acted as midwives, nurses, or assisted villagers who were sick. Those who were accused were placed on trial. If they were found guilty, the punishment was death. By the time the hysteria ended, 19 women had been hanged, and 1 man was crushed to death beneath a pile of heavy stones. No one is quite sure what caused the sudden panic over witches in Salem Village and nearby Salem Town in 1692. Some have simply attributed this to mass psychogenic illness or mass hysteria. Rampant accusations and fear fueled the frenzy which eventually led to the executions. Deeply held religious beliefs and the superstitions of the day also helped drive the events forward. Mass hysteria could also help explain the mysterious affliction of the village girls. Seeing friends exhibit certain unexplained behaviors might have led to other girls believing that they too were suffering the same symptoms. Others suggest that the real cause of the Salem witch trials was a long-standing feud between different families in Salem Village. The little community was strongly divided into different groups who struggled with each other for dominance within the village. It is possible that the parents of the afflicted girls manipulated the situation in order to remove opposing forces within the town. Other theories have been suggested as well. Some have speculated that the townspeople had been poisoned by eating large amounts of moldy rye, which contains a chemical which can cause hallucinations and erratic behavior. Still others have suggested that perhaps the afflicted girls simply enjoyed the power that they held over the entire village, since others would do anything to avoid having an accusatory finger cast in their direction. Regardless of the cause, the hysteria surrounding the trials continued into the next year, but eventually reached a conclusion in May of 1693. 20 people had lost their lives, and Salem Village had forever earned its mark in the history books.
All right. I think the most, we'll take a break here in a few minutes, the most, or probably the theory that is one of the more accepted theories is the families that were at odds with each other in Salem Township. And, a lot of times, I think when, we hear about the Salem witch trials and we just hear about them and basically get the gist that, they were supposedly trying witches. And, but a lot of times it's surprising when you first get into the supposed reasons for it, the details about it, that it's something that is fairly common. I'm not saying people contorting themselves and doing those things is common, but the causes of it are common things that you wouldn't think of. And so it's not something that was just regulated to the New World. We might think that with how the New World was so different than England, that something bizarre like this would come up. There were cases also in Europe of supposedly witchcraft and trials of witches. So just a little glimpse into that part of colonial life. Let's take a 7-minute break and we'll come back at 10:22 and start to look at the leading up to the Revolutionary War. So 7-minute break. Anybody have any questions that they need to ask while we're having a break? For those of you who came in late in Spiro, I have graded several tests and we'll complete grading those today. So you'll want to check your Blackboard to see what you made. So far, all A's and B's, so glad to see that. Okay. I think I mentioned Tuesday the informal policy of Britain called salutary neglect. It wasn't an official written policy, but basically the British were really preoccupied in their competition with France and Spain, and to be the world empire. And these countries also had territories in other locations that they clashed over. And so Britain was really focused on their competition with France, especially, to the point where they, as long as the colonists were paying their taxes, they were sending over tobacco, other raw materials that were financially helping England. They just kind of let them do their own thing. Salutary neglect. And so in the New World, let me put this map back up. So you will recall that the territory, if we basically go from the Mississippi River east, except for Florida, you have France and England. And so England and France are, vying for territories in other places like India. And England is really not worried about the colonists. And the French continue to build forts pretty much on the edge here of where the territory met. British colonies and France territory. They continued to build forts as a buffer between them and the British. I'm going to go to another map now. The French, you'll recall, they primarily were fur traders. They had a good relationship with the Native Americans, and they really were not colonizing their territory. They were not sending over people to establish colonies and settlements. Primarily, it was fur traders, explorers, and they did not build towns and villages. They built primarily forts. And so I showed you the line, and that line basically comes, now you can see here, here's Philadelphia, here's New York. So Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, and then part of Virginia down here. And so they were building forts through here. This is up in the upper middle colonies in New England, through the Ohio Valley. And around 1753, they built this Fort Duquesne. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Someone who maybe has taken French can correct me on that. And it was very close to Virginia, up here in this section of Virginia. And so the Virginia governor sent a young American military man named George Washington to go and not really raid it, but to kind of to go and survey it and look things over. And Washington and his men came upon a small French expedition that they surprised and they were able to defeat. And they then stayed in Fort Necessity. That was a colonial fort, very close to the French fort. Well, the French sent a stronger regiment to fight and defeat Washington and his men. And this was the beginning of the French and Indian War, 1754, sometimes referred to as the 7 Years' War. And so this war went on and then officially ended in the Treaty of Paris in 1763 officially brought these hostilities between England and France to an end. Although by 1761, England had basically defeated the French, Spain jumped in 1762, and nothing really resulted of that. So what happened in those 7 years was the French only had about 60,000 people, remember, 60 to 100,000 people. And the colonies had upward of around 2 million. The colonies were able to put together local militias much quicker. And so the French relied upon their alliances with the Native Americans, and thus the French and Indian War. There were some tribes in the northeast regions that did fight with the British. The British tried to get remember the Iroquois Nation or the Iroquois League, tried to get them to join their side, but they kind of stayed neutral. And that war was fought, with eventually England coming out the victor over France. And the Treaty of Paris in 1763 resulted in the French surrendering. Let me go back to this map. The French surrendered all their territory east of the Mississippi to England, all the way up into Canada too. So this all became English territory. Also for France, everything west went to Spain. So France was really the losers in this treaty. So after that long war, Britain's holdings have more than doubled when it comes to the North American continent, specifically the United States of America area. Any questions so far before we move on? Here you can see the British gains. So with more territory, the colonists in the New World wanted to continue or to pick back up with their migration westward. Remember, they really couldn't do that because of the Native American tribes that were still in here. So they wanted to pick back up and continue to move westward now that these Native Americans were no longer aligned with France. But the Native Americans did not want that. And so what England did was they declared the Proclamation of 1763. And this was basically a proclamation that said this green line here, I believe it included two main rivers. Let me go back to this one. Yeah. The sources of the Mohawk River and the Hudson River would act as a dividing line between the colonists and the Native Americans. So here you can see the line all the way down to Georgia. England said, you cannot go past this line west. And they also told settlers who had already gone west of this line to come back into the colonies. So, of course, this angered the colonists. They're the ones living here, right? They're the ones starting a life here, trying to establish their farms, their businesses, their livelihoods. They wanted to expand. They're the ones who are here. How can the leaders back in England, how can they exercise this authority when they're not even here? And here were the different perspectives from the British in England and the colonists here in America after the 7 Years' War. Britain felt like they had protected their people from the French and the Native Americans. The Americans were proud that they contributed to winning this war. Therefore, they expected the mother country to really be grateful, because now, and they're thinking, we'll be able to, work more land, produce more crops, and also mine more natural raw materials and send them back to England. And so taxes should not go up. But those in Parliament, the leaders over in England, felt like, we took on a massive debt here in protecting our people. We took on a lot of debt, so we're going to have them pay for this debt. And so they started increasing taxes. That did not go over well. And so for the colonists, a mentality started to really grow at a rapid rate of, we're over here and they're over there. it's basically them, the Parliament and or Parliament and the higher up English leadership in England against we colonists. Even though we're British colonists, we're over here. And so that increased. And you start seeing more and more seeds of rebellion towards England. And so England, the leaders in Parliament said, we need to put more troops. We need to keep the troops that we sent over there for the war and maybe send more, of course, to keep France from regaining territory, but also to keep these rebels, or to kind of keep this growing rebellious attitude from getting out of control. So the Proclamation of 1763, in your note keeping, you might say, is the first action that the British government took against the colonists. And while England might have had good intentions, keep the colonists from fighting with the Native Americans, and less bloodshed, less war, less conflict is good. Help the colonists stay focused on producing that tobacco and other crops that they produced, and taxing them for those things, and getting lumber and other raw materials from the New World. That was their intention, even though there was some, selfish gain, selfish motives for the English. So far we can sum it up this way. The French and Indian War was about real estate, right? More territory. And now the Proclamation of 1763, while there is an element of protecting the people from more conflict, let's help them to get back focused on what's going on in the colonies, and helping continue to be a cash cow for England. And we're going to tax them too, to help with the war debt. This was not something that the colonists embraced, of course. This is just another map showing you where the 13 colonies are, as in conjunction with the Proclamation line of 1763. This became an Indian reserve. Any questions on the Proclamation of 1763 or the 7 Years' War? So when we pick up on Tuesday, we are going to continue to look at the a domino effect of legislation that the British just continually put upon the colonists in the 1760s and 1770s. So basically from 1764, we'll pick up there with the Stamp Act, up until 1774, the beginning of the revolution, as far as the First Continental Congress, not the actual fighting, but that 10-year period, we're going to look at several different domino effect movements by the British that will just continue to anger the colonists and rebellion slowly grows until it becomes revolution. All right, one last time. Any questions? I will have the recording of the class up today, as well as some of those slides. And then your tests will be done grading probably by 2. So along with assignments that some of you have turned in. So have a great weekend. And if there's no other questions, we will end the meeting. We'll see you on Tuesday.